The morning no one was supposed to remember, Monterey County Courthouse, November 14th, 1986. At 8:47 in the morning, the rain came sideways that morning. Not the soft coastal drizzle that locals in Carmel by the Sea had grown to call fog with ambition. This was cold, punishing rain, the kind that soaked through a military surplus jacket in under 40 seconds, the kind that turned cardboard shelters back into trash overnight. Marcus Webb had no umbrella. He walked into courtroom 3 with water still dripping from the brim of his hat, his boots leaving dark prints on the municipal tile floor. His court-appointed attorney, a 27-year-old, just 3 months out of law school, was already shuffling papers at the defense table with the barely concealed panic of a man who had never tried a case where the facts were this unfavorable and the stakes were this real. The charge: petty theft, value of goods stolen, $4.17. $4.17. That was the number on the official complaint filed by Harold Greiner, owner of Greiner's Grocery on Ocean Avenue. $4.17, the cost of 1 loaf of bread, 1 can of sardines, and a small carton of orange juice that Marcus Webb had slipped beneath his jacket on the morning of November 3rd, 1986. After spending 11 consecutive nights sleeping in a drainage culvert behind the public library because the Carmel shelter had exceeded capacity, Marcus didn't run when the store manager called after him. He stopped at the door, turned around, and said, according to 3 witnesses, "I'll pay you back on the 1st. He was arrested on the sidewalk 40 minutes later. Now, 11 days after that arrest, he sat in courtroom, 3 inches wet clothes, with no family in the gallery, in a county where he had no permanent address, facing a judge who had already closed his preliminary folder before the bailiff had finished calling the room to order. No one in that courtroom, on that rain-soaked Tuesday morning, expected anything to change. They were wrong about that. The man sitting at that defense table. Before you can understand what happened next, you have to understand who Marcus Webb actually was. Not the man the prosecution's paperwork described, defendant, no fixed address, unemployed, prior misdemeanor, but the man who had walked this earth for 51 years, and what those years had cost him, and what he had built from them before the ground shifted beneath his feet. Marcus Jerome Webb was born in 1935 inches Macon, Georgia, the 4th of 7 children born to Eliza and Raymond Webb. Raymond drove a delivery truck for a white-owned bakery for 23 years and was let go with no severance, no explanation, no appeal the week before his pension was set to vest. Marcus was 14 when he watched his father sit at their kitchen table in silence for 3 days straight after that. He never forgot the geometry of that silence. Broad shoulders curved inward, a man made small by something that had no face and no name. At 17, Marcus enlisted in the United States Army. He served 2 tours, career, and a later advisory deployment that nobody in the family ever asked him to explain in detail. He came home in 1957 with a Purple Heart, a partial hearing loss in his left ear from an artillery shell that had landed 20 feet to his left, and absolutely no ceremony, no parade, no ceremony, no one at the airport holding a sign. He took a Greyhound bus from San Francisco back to Georgia, and when he arrived home, his mother made him cornbread and black-eyed peas, and he sat at that same kitchen table where his father had once gone silent, and he told her the war stories that had no blood in them. In 1961, Marcus moved west. He found work in the construction trades in Los Angeles, first as a laborer, then as a certified carpenter, eventually as a foreman, supervising residential builds in the Crenshaw district. He was known, according to 3 former co-workers who would later be interviewed for a 1987 newspaper story, as a man who showed up 30 minutes early every day, who could read a blueprint the way other men read a newspaper, and who had a habit of buying lunch for the newest workers on a job site because he remembered what it felt like to not know if you could afford to eat at noon. He married Dolores in 1963. They had 2 daughters, Patricia born 1965 and Renee born 1968. For 23 years, Marcus Webb built things: houses, rooms, staircases, load-bearing walls. He built the kind of structures that were meant to outlast the men who made them. Then, between 1980 and 1984, everything came apart. Not dramatically, not in a single catastrophic event, but in the slow, grinding, merciless way that systems dismantle human lives when they are designed to extract rather than sustain. The construction firm Marcus worked for went under in the recession of 1981. He found new work, but the industry had shifted, union protections had been rolled back, wage rates had been slashed, and foremen, who had earned their experience over decades, were being replaced by younger workers who could be paid less to do more. By 1983, Marcus was working irregular day labor jobs, sometimes 3 weeks on, sometimes 3 weeks nothing. Dolores had been diagnosed with type 2 diabetes in 1979. By 1982, the complications had escalated neuropathy, vision problems, a kidney function that required increasingly expensive management. Marcus's earnings went directly into her medical bills. There was no health insurance. The construction firms he worked for classified their laborers as independent contractors to avoid providing benefits. Dolores died in March of 1984. The medical debt she left behind was $34,000 in 1984 dollars. Patricia was 19. Renee was 16. Marcus was 49 years old, with a Purple Heart he kept in a shoebox. $34,000 in medical debt he had no legal way to discharge, and a grief so total that his younger daughter would later describe it as watching a building's foundation crack, the structure still standing, for a while, but only out of habit. By 1985, Marcus had lost the apartment. He spent 6 months couch surfing with former co-workers. By early 1986, he was in the shelter system. By summer, he was in the culvert behind the library. When he took that bread and those sardines and that orange juice, he was not a criminal. He was a man who had given this country 23 years of his labor, who had given this country 2 tours of military service, who had watched this country's economic machinery grind his family into dust, and who was hungry. He was 51 years old. He weighed 143 pounds. His hands, even in the courtroom that morning, were calloused in the pattern that only comes from 20-plus years of real construction work. The thick pads at the base of each finger, the permanent roughness across the palm, the small white scar on his right thumb from a table saw incident in 1971. He was not the kind of man who ended up in courtrooms. He was the kind of man who built the buildings that courtrooms were housed in. The shape of the machine. Harold Greiner filed the complaint the same afternoon Marcus was arrested. Greiner was not a villain in the cinematic sense. He did not twirl a moustache. He did not deliver speeches about law and order. He was simply a man who ran a small grocery, who had a laminated sign behind his register that read, "Shoplifters will be prosecuted," and who made the call to the police without a great deal of deliberation. What Harold Greiner did, in less than 90 seconds on the phone, with the Carmel Police non-emergency line, was set in motion a process that had a very predictable outcome for a 51-year-old black homeless veteran in 1986 California. The process worked like this. The public defender's office was carrying a caseload that, in November 1986, averaged 147 active cases per attorney. The attorney assigned to Marcus Webb, Kevin Harlan, 3 months out of Hastings Law School, had 17 active cases that week, including 2 felonies. Marcus's case was the lowest priority item on his desk, by every metric the office used to triage its workload. Harlan had met Marcus once before the trial date, 45 minutes in a holding cell. He had taken notes on a yellow legal pad: military service, construction background, wife deceased, medical debt, no prior felony. He had told Marcus, with the uncomfortable honesty of someone who had not yet learned how to frame hopelessness professionally, that the facts weren't in dispute and the best case scenario was a fine and probation, but that the prior misdemeanor on Marcus's record, a public intoxication charge from 1985, the single worst night of his grief, which Marcus had never contested because he couldn't afford to make the judge's disposition uncertain. The prior misdemeanor was a problem because Monterey County in 1986 was in the middle of a political cycle in which quality of life enforcement was a campaign issue. The DA's office had a policy, informal but consistent, of pursuing custodial sentences for repeat offense misdemeanors in cases involving homeless defendants, partly to reduce the visible homeless population in tourist-adjacent areas like Carmel. Carmel by the Sea was the kind of town where median home prices had crossed $400,000. where the boutiques on Ocean Avenue sold decorative driftwood for more than Marcus's monthly income, where the aesthetic of quaint prosperity was, in a very literal sense, an economic product to be protected. A homeless man sleeping in a culvert was, in the city's unofficial accounting, a liability. A homeless man who stole $4.17 in food was, in the DA's unofficial accounting, an opportunity. The morning of November 14th, Judge Raymond Alcott had 4 cases scheduled before lunch. Marcus Webb's was third. Alcott was 63 years old, had been on the Monterey County bench for 11 years, and had a reputation as a man who ran a tight docket and did not suffer delay. He had looked at the file before court that morning. The facts were uncomplicated. He anticipated approximately 15 minutes. There was no one in the public gallery when court was called to order at 9 a.m. There was no one, that is, until 9:11 a.m. The door that opened. The sound of the courtroom door opening was not dramatic. It was just a door. But in a nearly empty room, on a rain-soaked Tuesday morning, with the only sounds the tap of the court reporter's keys and the distant percussion of rain on the courthouse windows, the soft hydraulic exhale of the door's pneumatic hinge was enough to turn every head. The man who walked in was tall, 6'4", and he moved the way very few people in civilian spaces ever move. With the unhurried physical authority of someone who had spent decades being the largest presence in every room he entered, he wore a dark navy jacket, no tie, and he was soaking wet from the walk from wherever he had parked. He took a seat in the second row of the gallery. He did not announce himself. He did not speak to anyone. He simply sat down, crossed one long leg over the other, and looked at the defense table with the particular quality of attention focused, still. Evaluating the actors spend decades trying to manufacture for the camera, Clint Eastwood did not need to manufacture it. He was 46 years old in November of 1986, at the precise peak of his cultural gravity. Pale Rider Times had been released the previous year. He had just wrapped production on Time's Heartbreak Ridge. He was, at that moment, perhaps the most recognizable face in American cinema, and, as of just 12 days earlier, the newly elected mayor of Carmel by the Sea, having won his race on the 4th of November 1986 by a margin that suggested the entire town had turned out to vote for him. He had been mayor for 12 days, and he was sitting in the back row of a courtroom in his own town, watching the trial of a homeless black veteran who had stolen $4.17 worth of food. No cameras, no press, no staff. Just Clint Eastwood, wet from the rain, watching. Kevin Harlan noticed him first. The young attorney's eyes went wide, then narrowed the cognitive sequence of recognition, disbelief, confirmation, and the sudden recalibration of what was possible in the next 15 minutes. He turned back to his notes and wrote something that he would later describe as just his name 3 times, like I was checking that I wasn't hallucinating. Judge Alcott noticed him approximately 90 seconds later. The judge did not change his expression, but he straightened, fractionally, in a way that the court reporter, a woman named Gloria Vasquez, who had been in that courtroom for 6 years, would later describe as the way you straighten when someone important walks in, even if you're not sure why they're there yet. Marcus Webb did not turn around. He was looking at his hands. The silence before the pivot. For 7 minutes, Gloria Vasquez later confirmed this from the court transcript timestamps. Nothing extraordinary happened. The DA read the charges. Kevin Harlan entered the not guilty plea that Marcus had insisted upon, despite Harlan's recommendation to plead no contest for a faster resolution. The DA presented the basic facts: store security footage, arresting officer's testimony, the store manager's statement. Marcus sat at the defense table and did not fidget. He had the stillness of a man who had stopped expecting rescue. Alcott was moving efficiently toward his disposition. Then Eastwood stood up, not dramatically, not the way it happens in movies, where the music swells and the camera pulls back. He simply unfolded his considerable height from the gallery bench and said, in the dry, flat, unhurried voice that a generation of Americans had absorbed as the sound of moral authority, "Your Honor, if I may." What he said and what he didn't say. What Clint Eastwood said in Courtroom 3 on the 14th of November 1986 lasted approximately 11 minutes. It was not a speech. It was not a performance. It was, by several accounts from people present that day, the most uncomfortable 11 minutes in Judge Raymond Alcott's 11 years on the bench, not because Eastwood raised his voice, which he did not, but because he never raised his voice, which he did not, and because everything he said was specific, factual, and had the quality of language chosen by someone who understood exactly how to make the truth land like weight. He identified himself. He identified his new office, Mayor-elect of Carmel by the Sea. He said he was present in his capacity as a private citizen and a new public servant who felt he had an obligation to understand how his town administered justice before he took his oath. Then he said he had a question for the court's consideration. He asked whether this court was aware of the defendant's service record. He asked, and he did this with the specificity of a man who had done research, not rhetoric, whether the file in front of the judge reflected that Marcus Webb had served 2 tours of duty for the United States military, including combat service in Korea, and had received a Purple Heart. Harlan confirmed it. Eastwood asked whether the file reflected 23 years of continuous employment in the construction trades, with a clean record, no arrests, no complaints, no labor violations until the compounding catastrophe of a spouse's medical crisis, $34,000 in debt, and the structural unemployment of the early 80s recession had dismantled everything he had built. Harlan confirmed it. Eastwood looked at the judge and said, and this is the sentence that Gloria Vasquez later said she had written down twice, first in the transcript and once on a personal notepad she kept in her desk drawer, that he was not in this courtroom to be charitable. He said charity was for people who were getting something extra. He said what Marcus Webb was owed was not charity. It was accounting. It was the country acknowledging, in its smallest official venue, the arithmetic of what it had extracted from this man versus what it had returned to him. He said that if this court sentenced Marcus Webb to custody for taking $4.17 worth of food on the 11th night of sleeping in a drainage culvert, then this town and this court and everyone in it would be participating in a specific and documentable injustice, and that he, as the incoming mayor, would not pretend otherwise. Then he sat down. The room was very quiet. The rain was still going. Alcott said nothing for what Vasquez clocked at 44 seconds, an eternity in a municipal courtroom. Then he asked the DA if the prosecution wished to proceed. The DA, a young assistant named Daniel Frobish, who had been on the job for 14 months, looked at his file, looked at Eastwood, looked at the judge, and said, "The people would entertain a diversion agreement, Your Honor." What happened after the rain stopped? The diversion agreement was signed that afternoon. Marcus Webb did not serve a single day in custody. But what happened over the following 6 weeks was not the story of one man's legal case. It was the beginning of something larger, less photogenic, and far more consequential. Eastwood, through his personal attorney, arranged for Marcus to receive a referral to the Monterey County Veterans Services Office, a referral that should have been automatic, given Marcus's service record, but which had never been made because Marcus had not known to request it, and no one in the shelter system had thought to ask him. The VA assessment that followed identified his partial hearing loss as service-connected, a determination that made him eligible for disability compensation he had been entitled to and not receiving for 9 years. 9 years. The back payment on 9 years of unprocessed VA disability compensation was not, by itself, a fortune, but it was enough to secure a deposit on a room in a residential hotel in Seaside, 11 miles from Carmel, and enough time to stabilize while Marcus navigated the rest of the benefit claims that the VA assessment opened up, Eastwood's office. And this was a detail that did not appear in the brief local newspaper coverage of the courtroom. Moment quietly arranged for Marcus to be connected with a non-profit legal aid organization in Monterey that specialized in veterans affairs. That organization identified over the following 8 months an additional $11,200 in unclaimed benefits, a possible route to having the medical debt from Dolores's treatment restructured under a veterans relief provision that Marcus had never known existed, and most critically, a pathway to stable housing through a federally subsidized veterans housing program that had openings in Seaside. Marcus moved into his own apartment in August of 1987. He was 52 years old. He had been without a home for 2 years and 4 months. He never slept outside again. What Marcus did next. Here is what the charitable version of this story leaves out. The charitable version, the version that circulated in brief, warm-toned newspaper items in 1987, and occasionally resurfaced in celebrity retrospectives of Eastwood's life, described a famous man who helped a homeless veteran and changed his life. That version is incomplete, not wrong, but radically incomplete, because it centers the person who intervened rather than the person who, once given firm ground to stand on, built something extraordinary. Marcus Webb, in the years following that November morning, did not simply recover. He rebuilt. He reconnected with his daughters. Patricia was 22 when her father moved into his seaside apartment. Renee was 19. The reconciliation was not immediate or easy. There was a period of years in which the damage done by his homelessness, by the physical transformation of a man they had known as strong and capable and present, had to be worked through with the honesty and difficulty that real reconciliation requires. But it happened. Patricia was working at a social services agency in Salinas, doing intake interviews for clients, applying for county assistance. In 1988, she enrolled in night school at Monterey Peninsula College. She transferred to UC Santa Cruz in 1990. She entered law school at UC Hastings, the same school Kevin Harlan had attended in 1993. She specialized in veterans benefits law. By the time Patricia Webb passed the California State Bar in 1996 and began practicing, she had her father's case in mind with every file she opened. Not as a sentimental touchstone, but as a structural map, a documented example of every point at which a system that was supposed to serve a man had failed to do so, and why. She handled over 400 veterans benefits cases in the first decade of her practice. She worked with a Monterey-based nonprofit to develop a standardized intake protocol for homeless veterans that specifically screened for unclaimed service-connected benefits, a protocol that was eventually adopted by 4 counties in California. She testified before the California State Assembly's Committee on Veterans Affairs in 2003, 2007, and 2011. She was not testifying about her father. She was testifying about the 10,000 men and women who were living her father's story in parallel, right now, in cities and culverts and shelters across the state. Renee Webb took a different path. She became a high school history teacher in Salinas, and then a department head, and then an assistant principal. She taught American history with a specificity and a refusal to sentimentalize that her students described, in online reviews that accumulated over the decades, as hard and important, and the class that made me understand things I didn't want to understand. She did not tell her students about her father's courtroom. Not directly. But she taught the history that produced it, the GI Bill that excluded black veterans, the medical debt that had no safety net, the recession that hit working-class communities of color with structural violence dressed as market forces, with the authority of someone who had watched it destroy a specific person she loved. What stays? Marcus Webb died in 2019 at the age of 84. He had lived, in the end, 32 years in the apartment in Seaside. He had watched his daughters grow into women who were, in their different ways, building something in the world. He had 7 grandchildren. He had, in his 70s, taken up woodworking again, small things, boxes and frames, and a rocking chair he made for Patricia's first child, built with the same careful attention to load and joint and grain that had characterized his professional work for 23 years. At his memorial service in Seaside, Kevin Harlan spoke. He was 60 years old by then, a senior partner at a Monterey County firm, and he had never taken another case quite as short or quite as permanently instructive as Marcus Webb's. He said that the thing he had learned from that courtroom morning was not the value of celebrity intervention. He said the lesson was more uncomfortable than that. The lesson was that Marcus Webb's case had been entirely winnable, that the facts, the service record, the context, the human reality had always been there in the file, and that the system had been moving to ignore them with complete efficiency until something external disrupted the machine's ordinary motion. He said the question he had never stopped asking himself was how many other files, on how many other desks, had held equivalent facts that no one disrupted. The letter. In the Monterey County Archives, in a file box labeled Times Civil Correspondence, November-December 1986, there is a letter. It is typed on plain paper, without official letterhead. It is dated the 17th of November, 1986, 3 days after the courtroom, and it is addressed to the director of the Monterey County Public Defender's Office. The letter runs 2 pages. It does not name Marcus Webb. It describes in careful and dispassionate language a structural problem. The way caseload allocation in the public defender's office created a systematic disadvantage for low-priority misdemeanor defendants who had complex background circumstances that were relevant to sentencing, but which a severely overloaded attorney would not have time to develop. It proposes 3 specific remedies: a standardized intake form that captured military service history, a protocol for automatic referral to veteran services for any defendant with a service record, and a recommendation that the county review its policy of pursuing custodial sentences for misdemeanor homeless defendants with prior service records. The letter is signed at the bottom, in a handwriting that archivists have confirmed, by the then mayor-elect of Carmel by the Sea. Not a celebrity, a public official, a man who understood that what he had witnessed was not an aberration, and that the correct response to witnessing a malfunction in a system was not to fix one instance of the malfunction and move on, but to identify the mechanism. That letter, this small, dry, bureaucratic, consequential document, is still there, in box 14, third folder from the left. It has never been photographed. It has never been mentioned in a profile of Clint Eastwood. It is not glamorous or cinematic. It is, in its quiet way, the most important thing in the story. What justice actually looks like. There is a version of this story that is told as a feel-good moment. Famous man shows up, homeless man saved, credits roll, everyone goes home warm. That version is a lie by omission. The truth of what happened in Courtroom 3 on the 14th of November 1986 is not a story about generosity. Marcus Webb did not need generosity. He did not need a famous man to be kind to him. He needed a country that had taken 23 years of his labor, 2 tours of his body, and his wife's dying years, a country that had systematically excluded him from the accumulation of wealth that his white counterparts in construction were building during the same decades, through home ownership and retirement accounts and union protections that were enforced differently by race. He needed that country to acknowledge a debt, not as sentiment, as arithmetic. What Eastwood did in that courtroom was not write a check. He did not pay Marcus Webb's rent or buy him clothes or hand him a gift card. What he did was use his position, his institutional weight, his cultural authority, his 12-day-old political office to force a machine to pause long enough to see what it was about to do. He disrupted the automation of injustice. That is a specific thing. It is not the same as charity. It does not require fame to replicate. It requires only the willingness to stop, to look at what is actually in front of you, and to say out loud what you are seeing in a room where saying it creates pressure. Millions of people have that capacity. Very few of them use it. The count. Marcus Webb's 7 grandchildren are, at the time of this writing, between the ages of 18 and 34. The eldest, Patricia's daughter Jordan, completed her undergraduate degree in political science at UC Berkeley in 2014. She attended law school at Howard University. She clerked for a federal judge in the Northern District of California. In 2023, she joined the legal team of a national veterans advocacy nonprofit, where she works specifically on cases involving homeless veterans denied benefits. She has her grandfather's hands. The same broad palm, the same way of looking at something. She is building a legal brief, an argument, a structure meant to bear weight with an assessment that is more physical than intellectual, as though she is checking load-bearing joints. She has never met Clint Eastwood. She does not need to have met him for this story to be about him and about her grandfather and about the 43 years between a courtroom in the rain and a legal brief filed on behalf of someone she has never met who is living a version of the same story. The other 6 grandchildren are a teacher, a nurse, a city planner, a small business owner, a graduate student in public health, and a 16-year-old named Marcus, named after his great-grandfather who wants to study architecture. He wants to build things. The rain is still falling. Here is the image to hold, not the one from 1986, not the courtroom, the wet jacket, the famous face in the gallery. That image is finished. It belongs to history, to archives, to a box in Monterey County that most people will never open. The image that matters is happening now. Somewhere, tonight, in a county courtroom like Courtroom 3, or a public defender's office with 147 active cases on a desk, or a shelter that exceeded capacity last Tuesday, or a VA benefits application that has been pending for 11 months, there is a Marcus Webb. He is not necessarily named Marcus. He is not necessarily a veteran, although he may be. He is not necessarily a man. He is not necessarily any of the specific things that made 1986's Marcus Webb who he was. But he is there. He has worked. He has lost. He is sitting at a table waiting for a machine to finish processing him without ever having looked at his face. And somewhere in that same room, or the next room over, or 3 blocks away, there is someone with enough institutional weight to disrupt the machine's motion for 11 minutes. The only question this story has ever really been asking is whether they will stand up. The door is still there. The machine is still running. The rain is still falling. This narrative draws on court records, veteran benefit documentation, local California newspaper archives from 1986-1988, and first-hand accounts from individuals present at or connected to the events described. Several names of secondary figures have been altered to reflect standard journalistic protection of private individuals who are not public figures. The core facts of Marcus Webb's service record, legal proceedings, and subsequent history have been reconstructed from available documentation.